All right, welcome to our panel, The Voice of What Can't Be Spoken, a conversation with US Poet Laureate Joy Harjo. Today we have an introduction by Thomas DiPiero, the Dean of the Dedman College of Arts and Sciences at SMU. And Joy Harjo will be in conversation with Katie Condon, who's the author of Praying Naked. Dean DiPiero, if you want to take it from here.
Thanks very much, and thank you everybody for being here. Before starting, I want to thank the executive director of this weekend's literary festival, Professor Sandria Smith. Professor Smith is the brains and the organizational brawn of the festival, and just kudos to her for putting together a really mesmerizing and truly distinguished program of speakers. This is just a terrific event. I am genuinely thrilled to introduce this afternoon's event. Joy Harjo is the Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry to the Library of Congress, more commonly known as the United States Poet Laureate, and she has been Poet Laureate since 2019. She is only the second Poet Laureate ever to be appointed to 3 terms, and she is the first Native American US Poet Laureate. I think everybody knows that Harjo is a remarkably talented and accomplished poet, musician, author, and playwright. She's the author of 9 books of poetry, most recently of the highly acclaimed American Sunrise. She also plays the alto sax with the band Poetic Justice. And as a musician, she has released 5 award-winning CDs featuring her own music and that of other Native American artists. Her expertise in Native American poetry has been put into play when she served as executive editor of the volume, When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Come Through, a Norton anthology of Native Nations poetry. She is also editor of Living Nations, Living Words, an anthology of First Peoples poetry. Harjo brings to her poetry the sonority, the resonance, the memory, and the emotion of Native poetry. She writes of ancestral lands and culture, and also, crucially, of their loss and of their theft. She mourns the loss of tradition, and with it, the identities that tradition confers. Harjo's work makes us confront perspectives that have been lost or destroyed. She keeps before us the violence done to America's first peoples. Loss and potential dwell in her poetry. For example, the first lines of Washing My Mother's Body, a spellbinding recuperation through memory of a ritual unavailable to her, announce, I never got to wash my mother's body when she died. I returned to take care of her in memory. What are the consequences of failed or thwarted rituals, of discontinued ways of being that nevertheless insist upon us? She explains, I step in to make my ritual, to do what should have been done, what needs to be fixed so that my spirit can move on. Elsewhere, she writes, history will always find you and wrap you in its 1,000 arms. I've always thought of poetry as a way to say things through language that can't really be understood through language. Harjo once said that it's important to have a doorway open to the place without words, but luckily today we have Joy Harjo to share her words with us. Ms. Harjo joins us in conversation today with my colleague, Katie Condon. Dr. Condon is Assistant Professor of English in Dedman College at SMU, and she is author of the recent book, Praying Naked, which was winner of the 2019 the Journal Charles B. Willer Poetry Prize. She has published dozens of poems in venues such as the New Yorker, Prairie Schooner, Plowshares, and many other highly regarded places. I'll turn things over to Professor Condon to get the conversation started. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dean DiPiero. I'm still getting used to the absence of applause. I'm applauding you. That was a beautiful introduction. And I think you said so many things that are true of Joy's work. Joy, we are thrilled to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, I'm really happy to be here. I wish it was in person. You guys aren't that far. We're not that far away. We're almost like sister cities, even though, of course, there's always that rivalry between Oklahoma and Texas. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I guess that's true. We would love to have you come to campus sometime, in the future for a visit or a different event, especially because you have some ties to SMU yourself. First of all, this isn't your first time at the Dallas Literary Festival. You were here in 1998, actually, when it was called the Southern Methodist University Literary Festival. So that's a kind of cool coincidence. But also, you have familial ties to the university. Your aunt Lois Harjo, whose picture I'm pulling up now, was an artist in residence at SMU in the 1940s. I know that Lois is very important to you. I was wondering if you could talk to us about why that is.
Well, she was like my mentor, my I don't know how you would say it. It's like how a grandmother. She stepped in because her sister Naomi Harjo passed fairly young after she gave birth to two children and passed. And so she stepped in to take that place. So she was more like a grandmother figure, but she was the one relative. You know how it is, you can be born into your immediate family and think that you're an alien. You've been dropped into an alien pod. It's not all that way, but when I, with her, I knew I had a place. There was someone, she was somebody, we had the same interests, we vibed. I learned so much from her, and she loved literature. Her place was stacked with history. A lot of the stories, I love the stories that she carried of her people. And I have a new memoir coming out in September from Norton called When the Poet Warrior Call for Love and Justice. And the memoir essentially starts out with, well, I do a couple of things, but the narrative starts out with I'm driving her around to see those people who know things, basically her age, in the Muskogee Creek community. And I love doing that because I'd get to hear stories and find out. Genealogy is a story. Genealogy holds the story. It's like the story keeper and the story keeper device. And so it starts out with that. And one of my favorite places to go is with our cousin, George Kozer Sr. The book ends with me sitting with George Kozer Jr. talking stories, talking the same things. Basically, time changes, but in some ways there's a lot that doesn't change, in our lives. So that becomes that's how the memoirs in a book ended.
I'm really glad you brought up Poet Warrior because I'm really looking forward to reading it. Your memoir, Crazy Brave, was just so beautiful and moving. But I wanted to ask you if you'd be willing to read an excerpt from Poet Warrior of your choosing. It doesn't have to be about your Aunt Lois, but this could give people a sense of what to look forward to when the memoir comes out in the fall. Is that something you'd be willing to do?
Yes, I was pulling something up and I might read, there's a couple of pages. There's a little skip in it, but these just came up. So I thought I'll read this.
Great.
And I say my sister-in-law, I have a sister-in-law who just passed. So I really appreciate, she always told me things that I didn't know that my mother said about me that were helpful to me. So I'll read this in honor of that gift she gave me. Your mother said she knew you would make it, my sister-in-law told me. She said that you knew how to survive. The others needed her more. If I consider that my purpose with her in this life was to stand beside her as her witness, her advisor, then I find peace. If I take away all the mothering expectations implied in the word mother, then my mother becomes a human being. I make peace with my personal story of mothering. This is about a third of the way through. I am honored to have served my mother. I am honored to be a mother. In our tribal nations' original teachings, mothers, Echki, are blessed. Women are honored as co-creators of the future with men. When we were colonized, female deities were deliberately disappeared from our indigenous stories. There is no female figure in Christianity's Trinity. Mothers lost their place next to the fathers. They were treated as property. Those roles in society filled by women and mothers, positions like teachers and childcare workers, became the least respected and valued, even though they are the most crucial. The word mother wants to take over this whole story, and there is no combination of words, sentences, or paragraphs that could carry that weight, that story, and how it was born from one mother to the next, from generations, from the beginning. When I speak with a close friend, She tells me that her mother is taking over her book of poetry, and the book isn't supposed to be about her, though she is part of the history. Is this the nature of mothers and mothering? Does each generation carry forth the wounding that needs to be healed from mother to mother, cooking pot to cooking pot, song to poetry, and poetry to beadwork, until one day in eternity we will understand what we have created together? And then this little section. When we are children, our parents are gods. They preside over our kingdom, which might be located in a house, an apartment, or even a single room or a car. Wherever it is, they root together. They have control, even if they are out of control. There are many kingdoms on a suburban street, in a city, in an apartment building, or along a country road. When I travel through a city, a town, countryside, or someplace else, here or in another part of the world, and pass by rows and rows of abodes, I think about all those small kingdoms, each hidden behind a doorway, behind each lighted or dark window. I think of all the stories we make and are making, each grandparent, parent, and child, and how each is rooted to earth and time. I'll never forget coming up to a stoplight in Calcutta, India, and there on the traffic island in the middle of the street, a family had made a home of materials they had scavenged from the dump. During the momentary stop, I had a brief window to a life, a family. Pans hung neatly on the wall. Mother's hair was pulled up and tied as she cooked the scant offering for dinner. Father held his baby daughter on his knee, and there she was, precious in her yellow dress, wrapped in her father's loving arms. The light changed, then we were gone. I still think about this family, pray for them. I wonder how old the girl is now, if the family is okay, if they are still there on that traffic island. I wonder of what use is poetry and writing, and how my words can matter if they cannot help this family. So those are two little sections from it.
I can't wait to read the whole memoir. I'm sure everyone is sitting here feeling the same way. I love, there's the train. My email dinged.
I told you, I warned you.
I love the way that you think about and talk about parenting and mothering specifically. You do so you talk about mothering in the same way that you talk about poetry, and I love this about you and your work, with a kind of reverence and respect for what we don't know about the job or the position of being a parent or a writer. And as a parent myself, with many friends who have young children, one thing that's been coming up is how challenging the pandemic has been. We're taking care of our kids at home. We're also trying to continue our lives as artists. And, you know, you have some experience with that kind of paradox yourself. And I'm wondering if you have any advice for parent artists trying to strike a balance. But I'm also curious to know whether you see any connection between creating and tending to human life and creating and tending to art.
Yes, I mean, that's sort of my whole life. Yeah, because then there were grandchildren, and now I have great grandchildren. I was a teenage mother, and then a grandmother in my 30s, and now I'm a great grandmother. It's given me a perspective, but it was a very difficult road. And when I was a little child, before I could speak, I knew I was going to be an artist. I wasn't sure what kind. My Aunt Lois was a painter. My grandmother also painted. I have two of their paintings. I know I should pick up my computer and take them in there. You could see one of Lois's paintings and one of my grandmother's painting of Osceola. But I always knew, from the time I was little, I knew that I was brought here to do I had something ahead of me to do. And even when I would get lost, and I write about that in the memoir, you know, it was still like a rudder. But it was difficult. I started writing poetry. I was an art major at the University of New Mexico. I was a single mother with 2 children, and I worked. I also had a job because I had been banished from, I never had that much, I didn't ever really have family support in that way. Everybody was involved in their own dramas. So I didn't have a circle. Like I watch my children, and they have, and it's it's an important role. We need those. We need that. That's why they call a nuclear family of two people nuclear, because it blows up usually. You know, two people cannot contain that power, so to speak. It's a lot, it's a burden. So I have a lot more compassion now when I look back. I used to be very hard, I'm still hard on myself, but I used to be hard on myself as a young mother because I thought, you know, I had failed my children in some way, even by pursuing my art. And then I realized, wow, what, you know, watching young people now, and a lot of them move into their parents' home or they can't, you know, I watch how hard it is.
Mhm.
And I've come to have a lot more compassion. Like, I do not know how I did it. I do not know how I made it through times when we had no money. I know that when I got scholarship money, I was the person I would pay ahead in rent. You know, I would buy school clothes. You know, I would do those things. And then when it came to creating, I usually did it when the kids went to sleep. My daughter wrote, she did an interview. She's become a really wonderful artist, and she was being interviewed, and she said, yes, I used to fall asleep to my mother's typing, you know, on a typewriter. And when I was writing, and then you can't hear painting, but I would stay up and paint and draw. And then I had to make a decision at one point, which was a very difficult decision, because I knew that I could not also pursue art and writing and work and raise children. And with no, you know, I had wonderful support from friends who became family, but without that kind of, so I had to, I remember walking into the art studio with the teacher who was a mentor to me and said I was changing my major, and I felt really bad. But my plan was, before the Poet Laureateship was announced, to start painting again. I have a studio now to paint in, and now it's going to be after Poet Laureate, after the Poet Laureateship is over. My last week of duty is the last week of April in 2020, coming up 2022, I think. And there's a big party. Everybody's invited in DC. But you are. So anyway, so I had to make that choice. And so my early poems were very like image. I had to write poetry between everything you do with raising children and my schoolwork and my classwork. And so my poems were generally fairly short and image, like single image driven. And what I noticed when I had my granddaughter, people don't really think about this. I mean, when you give birth, your milk lets down, there's this whole shift. Even while you're pregnant, there's this whole shift in the way that the world literally shifts because you have to accommodate. It's instinctual. I used to marvel at, I would sit there and marvel and just watch my instinct take over and do things. And my mind would be watching and saying, whoa, that's really, you know, it's interesting to see how much is just built in. But,
Right.
yeah, isn't that? And then, but when I had my granddaughter, the same thing, something else kicks in, and that's when I started writing more like stories.
That is really interesting. And the way that you describe instinct sort of kicking in and you sort of watching yourself from afar reminds me of some of the way that some poets talk about the experience of writing poems, when you can access that space that sort of allows you to transcend beyond whatever room you're writing in or the present moment. Is that, would you agree with them?
Yes, and I am finding that it happens even when I'm even doing Q&A sometimes, or even, you know, which is a kind of, you know, teaching is a kind of performance, and anything that what I'm doing, I always ask for help and ask for assistance, even to sit down and write, because as you know, if you've done any kind of creative work, and even a scientist, someone involved in other methods of discovery, you find out that often those brilliant ideas or those lines or that doesn't come from your mind. It might come through, but it comes in the larger space. The mind is only one frequency, or one, you know, it might be a couple of bands, but it's within a certain frequency. But when you're working in that kind of creative space, which if you think about it, pregnancy and that building and all of that, that's a creative space. So you're in that, you kind of move into that. Well, you do that when you're writing art. I mean, the best, I didn't think a lot of these poems in my mind. I brought in all of my tools and I hone my tools and I listen, and I'm always building that base. But what makes the spirit of a poem? That's what I love about poetry, is that it teaches me, and I go into places that I don't know. Well, even writing this memoir, things come to me. I think, well, that's cool. I hadn't thought of that. Otherwise, something you get into a lope or a rhythm. It's all rhythm based. I think it's like any drummer of a band, anybody in a band will tell you that. I think any poet would tell you that. It's all kind of rhythm based. It's all of it is.
Yeah, I want to go back to something you just said about sort of discovering as you're writing, this idea that you go into a poem sort of not knowing what's going to happen. And you have this really wonderful moment in Crazy Brave where you say that the spirit of poetry is a tall ancestor spirit who's been with you since the beginning, or a bear or a hummingbird. It is 100 horses running the land in a soft mist, or it is a woman undressing for her beloved in firelight. It is none of these things. It is more than everything. And like I said before, you have just such a beautiful reverence for poetry. You're sort of without skepticism of what poetry can do for us and to us and for and to the world. And I'm wondering if you can describe what you think poetry is capable of, especially in our moment of sort of global chaos that it seems like we're emerging from. But I wonder if you could talk to us about that, what the art form is capable of achieving or doing for us.
I think during the pandemic and during this rising of, the social, political mayhem we've been dealing with, the poetry has, the use of poetry and what we've been seeing, the uses of poetry and what poetry can do, and how it's a most important tool in developing awareness, consciousness, a sense of collective spirituality, and a sense of, and I'm not talking about religion, I'm talking about a sense of collective spirituality where everything is connected and our actions are connected to everyone and to the earth. So we've been seeing what poetry holds, what words cannot hold. And that's what I love about it. It gets frustrating, but it's also at the same time liberating to be able to use words as tools to become something that holds what is ineffable, what is unspeakable, even what is unbelievable sometimes in our histories and what we've gone through. They hold grief. They hold grief that cannot be held by a nation or by a family or by a person. And that's the role of poetry. And that's why we've seen, the sites, the American Academy of Poetry, Poetry Society of America, all these sites have seen tremendous flow during this time because we've come to see the usefulness of poetry, what it's capable of and what it can do.
Mm-hmm. It seems like you're always writing about what you just described, particularly histories, transcending time, investigating, you didn't use this word, but the word sort of historical trauma occurs to me. And it seems like you take on those themes head on in your most recent collection of poetry, An American Sunrise. You're sort of facing history and asking your readers to face history really directly. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the making of that collection, or the importance of history, specifically thinking about that collection, or place, anything you'd like to share. I think the collection's so brilliant. That's 6 questions in one, Joy. Can you handle it? How's that?
Yeah.
I guess you could just start by describing the collection and how it came to be.
Yes, who was it? Somebody I read recently had described it better than I could. Where it's a kind of a book of witness, of it's almost like witness, singing, journalistic kind of documentary, historical, etc. But this book came about. I wasn't planning on writing a book of poetry. In fact, I remember sitting in my office at UTK, and I was sitting there with my assistant Jeremy, and I was laying out a list. I was showing him a list of my priorities, and at the bottom of the list was a book of poetry. But one day, I had come to that part to the south. My husband and I are both Muskogee Creek. We're both a Giabova ceremonial ground, and our families have roots that go especially down towards Georgia. Mm-hmm. And but Alabama, my one part of my Muskogee Creek family were on the Trail of Tears from Talladega, Alabama, Monopoly, and my great grandmother, 6 generations, Betsy Kozer. And so I remember, so we went all over the South when we were there. And I also, when I was being interviewed for the job, I told them, I said, well, my great grandfather used to come up here with his warriors to steal horses. Only they weren't stealing them. These were their lands. I still got hired anyway. But I used to laugh with my assistant Jeremy because his family were some of the people that my family stole horses from, most likely. And then here we are years later, sitting in a room in the McClung Tower, working together. And I think, well, isn't life interesting? But anyway, what happened, I looked out, I knew this was what was I had a hard time. It's a contradiction. And that's why another reason I go to poetry. Where do you put contradictions? So my people had fought so hard to stay in home, like you would. Anybody have a home, and you had somebody else, like another group of people, come in and with gunpoint, you would fight to stay in your home, your people. For this was the trees, the land. Those were our, we didn't really have. Those were our churches. Was the whole land, mm-hmm. And the stories are embedded there, and our way of life, and just like they are now, and what we wear, where we get our materials and stuff. We were being uprooted. It wasn't right, so they fought. Mm-hmm. And yet, despite that, it was overwhelming, and we were led by gunpoint, forced by gunpoint out of our homes. Mostly they didn't burn behind us because they wanted them. We had some nice houses and pianos and all that. Mm-hmm. So we were forcibly removed. And the book started when I knew I was excited about going back to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I am now, which is where the Creek tribe is in this area. And I'm thinking, what do I do with that? Here I am excited, but it was so sad. We had to go through a lot of grief coming back to that part of the world, and our people were not there. And yet the plants were, all the stories, the roots of the stories were there. We knew a lot of them, and we were going back and visiting. So I looked out into the trees, and my spirit asked me, what did you learn here? And that's how the book started.
And what did you learn there? I suppose maybe
you have to read the book.
Yeah. Right? Is there a poem you could share with us from the book that can speak to that question? What did you learn here?
Oh man, let's see. I could play one of my songs with one of the poems.
That'd be great.
I could do an American Sunrise. This is a new album out. And this is called An American Sunrise. I also play saxophone. It won't be too long. I can cut it down if I need to.
We were running out of breath as we ran to meet ourselves. We were surfacing the edge of our ancestors' fights and ready to strike. It was difficult to lose days in the Indian bar if you were straight. Easy if you played pool and drank to remember, to forget. We made plans to be professional, and some of us could sing. We drove to the edge of the mountains with a drum. We made sense of our beautiful crazed lives under the starry stars. We learned the devil from the Christians. We sang. We were the heathens, but needed to be saved from them. Thin chants. We knew we were all related in this story. A little gin will clarify the dark and make us all feel like dancing. Make us feel like dancing. Make us feel like dancing. Be-ba, 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 be-ba. Argued with the music as I filled the jukebox with dimes in June. 40 years later, and we still want justice. 40 years later, and we still want justice. We are still America. Way-ah, hey-ah, way-ah, ho. Way-ah, hey-ah, way-ah, ho. Way-ah.
I stopped it a little short because I just got carried away on the saxophone.
No, it's an amazing rendition of the title poem of your collection, An American Sunrise. And it makes what is already clear in the poem even more discernible, which is there's a kind of joy or ecstasy in contrast to this sort of grief of this intense, huge grief of being pushed out of the homeland, of being murdered along the way, you know, with no sort of effort of repair on, you know, America's parts. And that contrast is so interesting to me. And I love listening to your music. And it makes me, you know, think about all of the other things you do too. You know, you're a poet laureate, you're a musician. You mentioned that you're going to get back into painting, but you also write drama and nonfiction. I'm wondering, for you, how do all of those different genres and mediums speak to one another in your work?
Well, I think of my saxophone voice, and by the way, I didn't start playing till I was almost 40. So I've heard people say, oh, I'm too old. I've always wanted to do such and such. You know, I think the spirit has no age. Mm-hmm. But I think of my horn voice, and I know some of my mentors, when I started learning to play, they said, oh my God, you're a poet. You're detracting from your gift. And it's like, now wait a minute. When I started learning poetry, I went to my tribal nation to see how poetry existed there. And yes, we have poets in books, but we just never grew up learning about them. But a lot of the poetry is in oratory and in the music, in lyrics and so on. So it's the same voice. The painting, I haven't done so much of that, but I've started sketching to get ready. And something may fall away then, like I'll probably stop traveling so much in a couple of years. I'm going to give myself another. Well, the Poet Laureateship will end, and Poet Warrior will be out, and then I'm going to start moving towards doing more of painting and not traveling so much.
Mhm.
But they all, I mean, they're all similar. I mean, yeah, playing a saxophone, it requires different muscles, and I'm learning bass and, pulling all that together, because I'd like to do an album where I play all the instruments. That's another thing I want to do. But yeah, they all kind of fit in. I mean, there's a certain kind of aesthetic. I mean, I could probably break down the music aesthetic too. And it's just it's the same voice.
Yeah. Just so the same voice sort of manifesting itself in at different volumes, registers, or is that?
It's like the tone. I guess if I think of voice, it's the tone. And then what I do in my poetry, I've never followed a particular school of poetry, and that hasn't really helped me in the poetry realm. It has not helped me. It has not helped me in that way. I didn't come in with a group or and yet I'm associated with, but I am not flat in that. And the same with my music. One time I had a thing where I had to go in and play with Oliver Lake and his band, but do poetry. Mm-hmm. And his band liked me. They said, "We'll play with you anytime. We like you. You have a whole different approach. You didn't come up through, well, we're going to learn jazz standards," which I do learn and practice, but you've taught yourself you've come through with a whole different manner. So I've kind of done the same thing with music that I've done with poetry. It's like it's my own voice.
Yeah. And that is so true, across your collections, your poetry collection specifically, I'll talk about now, though I'm sure it's true of your music too. There are many different sort of aesthetic styles, many different forms that you use. And one poem, when I was rereading your collection, Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings, one poem that I had read many times before, but that just, affected me totally differently, was the poem Charlie and the Baby. And it seems very sort of voice driven, actually, in a way that I think is different than some of the other poems in the book. Anyway, I have a question that I'd like to ask about that poem. I was wondering if you could read it for us.
Yes, and I like that you picked that out, because a lot of the other poems, because of history, etc., they get pulled out and read a lot. And I rarely read this one aloud, but it brings up a lot for me. Charlie is Charlie Hill. He was an Oneida comedian and fostered a lot of breakthroughs, in comedy, especially for natives. But he was on all the big shows, and I was living in LA for a while. I was commuting I taught at UCLA for a while, and then I would commute to Hawaii, where I was racing out with your canoes. And that's another story. But I started running into Charlie everywhere, so we would hang out. And then we would talk on the phone. And then he passed, but he was so happy with when he had his granddaughter. So I wrote this for him. Charlie and the Baby. Charlie was in Venice, wheeling his granddaughter in a stroller down the boardwalk through noisy spring crowds. He was the happiest he'd ever been. He was with the baby. The sun and the ocean who busied herself carrying time and breaking it against sand. In the sky over Charlie and the baby were flights coming in from Hawaii, China, and other lands. They circled like reachable stars. Men fished from the pier, mothers unfolded picnics as children played hide and seek. In the blue breathed immense light beam. In the blue, comma, I should have put in there. In the blue breathed immense light beams from their eyes. We were lost and small. Charlie called and asked me how I was doing. I probably recited the usual, I'm living a life that takes me almost everywhere. Jet lag, band practice, the kids, poems. Charlie was weary with the poverty of making a living of comedy. We laughed. I could smell sea riding wind, could hear the baby's laughter. New plants were growing from the grief of my mother's recent death. We listened. As for poets, I said, it's about the same. We talked what we always talked. History, saxophones, kids, words, Floyd, Buffy, Jennifer Jesus, healing, airplanes, Floyd, prayers, philosophy, Indians, and why we're in the predicament we're in. Every word that's ever said tries to find a way to live. You're gone now, and I'm still in this predicament called living, Charlie. I imagine things don't change much when you cross the line. You're still you, and I'm still here at the other end of this long, long wave, listening.
It's just such a moving poem. And this will be the last question I ask you because I want to leave some time to get some questions from our participants today. But part of what is so moving to me about this poem is the lyric address at the end when the speaker engages Charlie in conversation and we find out that he's passed away at some point during the poem's making. And I'm wondering if in your own poetry, if that kind of dialogue or address is just a kind of poetic performance or purely a poetic device, or if you think that poetry can serve as a means of connecting across time, like a true connection across time or history or even realms.
I think it's true. It's not a device. I was thinking what you said earlier too about skepticism, and I think that's why my poetry was never that popular in the mainstream, in the main, hip, is because I'm not acting with great skepticism. I'm not developing this voice of skepticism or device, a voice of devices, which becomes so apparent because when you get older, those drop away anyway. And my poetry was old long before I was.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, there's definitely, I still talk to Charlie, certainly about different things, but even my Aunt Lois, I mean, she's remained, there was a period, and I won't go into that horrible story where I was going to leave a university that I loved so much. And there was a horrible story that happened and we couldn't change it. And I remember going in and getting in my office I loved, I called my son-in-law and said, could you come over? I have boxes here and I'm going to clear out my office. And he came over. I had the exact number of boxes. And one of them, when I was putting things in, I found letters from my Aunt Lois. And I remember sitting there in my place later that night with those boxes and feeling grief because I loved that place, but I could not morally or ethically stay. And I was reading her letters and then there she was.
That's amazing.
And that's, and like this poem, it holds. But I like that a poem can hold, it can hold a time, it can hold, I can smell the sea, and I can Venice Beach,
Yeah.
I can feel his happiness because he has his granddaughter. And, and the hard life he had trying to, you think, poets making a living, try making a living as a comedian. It's not very funny. Yeah.
No, I've heard really. Well, Joy, I think that's an appropriate place to end, circling back to your Aunt Lois, who's so dear to you. And I think let's grab some questions from our audience. Here's one from John Sullivan. He's struck by the thought from the memoir, quote, I wonder of what use is poetry in writing if I can't help this family in Calcutta. And he wants to know, have you seamlessly reconciled this, or do you compartmentalize your art and your activism to get the most scope and velocity from each aspect of your life?
I'm not very good at compartmentalizing. I think it's a female thing. I've discussed that with my husband a lot because, we were talking and he says that men tend to do that. So I said, I have to learn how to do that. So I spent some time, and I'll do it sometimes and think, okay, I'm going to try compartmentalizing. But I always remember Audre Lorde, and I write about her in the memoir too. She was a mentor, saying that there was no separation between the personal and the political.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think there is. I mean, I think even writing to bring consciousness, it will bring when you write, it brings people's minds together. Mm-hmm. And so next time they see someone, maybe they'll see them as a human being. That would make a difference. As somebody with dignity, rather than in maybe some societies, they would call them failures or say that the earth needs to be rid of people like that, or or we should put them in cages. We should put them in cages and take their children away from them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which has happened to people at the border. It happened in Indian country when even a son-in-law I had was scooped out of his front yard by missionaries. And this was not, 30 years ago, because the family lived in poverty, but they were a family. But they thought, well, they're not living like we are, so we should take them away. And that's, there's this part of the story. Mm-hmm. So if it can make a difference, and I remember Leslie Silko telling me that too. She says, my activism is my writing.
Right.
Yeah.
And that there's a long tradition of that. I listened to an interview with you and Rita Dove recently. You both were sort of talking about that. Muriel Rukeyser has said as much. Adrienne Rich, of course, is famous for making the personal political sort of tie. This brings me to a question from Dr. Monica Marchi. It's appropriately sort of a political question. She wants to know, how significant is Deb Haaland's nomination as Interior Secretary?
It's extremely significant on a lot of levels. When I need to pull he may have been the first head of that department who his mission, what he felt was his mission, was basically to eradicate natives, and now we have Deb Haaland, her life has always been about care for the environment and for community, for communities, for sustainable communities. Deb was my poetry student when I was teaching at the University of New Mexico in the 90s. And she came into my office with her motorcycle helmet because she had a motorcycle because she did not want to contribute, to more gas, use up. She didn't want to use up resources that a car would use, and thought it was better to use it. That was her thing. That's always been her thinking. It wasn't anything invented to get elected. That is who she is.
That's amazing.
And that's just one example. But I love it. She was a poet. She published as a poet in creative writing. I think she even, it may have become her major. I'll have to ask her. We're still friends. We became friends, and she later worked for me. And then when I went to UCLA, she came out in UCLA and studied out there too. But it's been incredible to watch this, watch how her, I would never have predicted it actually. Yeah, but it's amazing. And she's got the goods, but we all of us who know what happens there intimately. I know people have been on the inside of all of that political, natives with politics in the US, she's got a job, and there will be tremendous resistance. And so a lot of us are kind of banding together so that she knows we're all here and that she's not alone, because that's going to be a hard job. But it's opened up. And I just saw right before I had to run over here, but it was nice. It was so beautiful out. The Tantu Cardinal, the really fine native actress, is in town. Well, they're going to start filming Killers of the Flower Moon. So she came into the bookstore, Magic City Books, and we met for a moment, and she's got some projects that she's working on. And what we agreed, that you never see natives we are not part of the national conversation.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And there's probably because, if we're still alive, then that means that there's something wrong with the Americans. There's something left out of the story of this country. And so that she became, even me becoming the poet laureate, what it did, the most important thing it did was made a consciousness of natives. It said there are natives in this country still, and some of them are poets, which meant so that the anthology followed nicely from there. It was not planned. It's like, yeah, and there are lots of poets. It's not
right,
just.
Right. Yeah, we unfortunately are out of time, and there's a couple more questions I didn't get to, but I just want to say that I think that anthology is so wonderful. And is it true that you have created, or you're going to create, sort of a digital map where people can see all of the different places that Native people and artists are residing currently, to sort of push back against that idea that you
Mhm.
are visible?
There is a map up now, Library of Congress, of a new book, a new anthology that will be out in May called Living Nations, Living in Words of Contemporary. The other one is is a compilation through time immemorial until present. But there are 47 contemporary Native poets where they live on a map that shows no political boundaries, no words, no cities, nothing except the mountains, the water,
Amazing.
and it's so beautiful. And then you have these poets who say, here's poetry. And so the poets also talk about place. So that's up now, and the book will be out in May. And if you want the CD called I Pray for My Enemies, you can get it from Magic City Books in I almost said Albuquerque, in Tulsa.
Well, Joy, thank you so much for being here with us. We have to make room for the next event. And to all of you who asked Joy questions that I didn't get to, I apologize. But thank you for being here with us. It was a huge pleasure to experience Joy's words with you. Go enjoy the rest of the festival. And thank you again so much, Joy. It's been a huge gift to be with you.
Thank you so much, Katie. And thank Thomas DiPiero for his great introduction. And you guys have a good time, and thank you.